Welcome. Welcome. Good evening. Good evening. And welcome, everyone, to the final installment of our lecture series, Vatican II and Ecumenism. It's kind of hard to believe that we've come to the fifth and final event in our 2.5 years of honoring milestones associated with the 50th anniversary of Vatican II. There's many people to thank. I would like to just do so briefly. I'd like to thank the Department of Theology for the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, the Benedictine Institute, the Collegeville Institute, the School of Theology, Kim Melby Tollefson, Jeannie Knaven, and I think the person who has sent us the most emails that we have received this semester, Sean Kohlberg, has done an amazing job of organizing this lecture series, and a lot of gratitude goes to him for his efforts. So thank you, Sean. So when we sat down 3 years ago, our goal was to have one lecture per semester to correspond with the 50th anniversaries of the Second Vatican Council. Originally, our plan was to highlight each of the 4 constitutions. When we began planning, we were sensitive to trajectories in the study of Vatican II. In recent years, leading theologians from around the world have called for a new approach to the study of the Council, one that is fitting with the Council's own texts, an approach where all of the Council's 16 documents are considered mutually interpreting, so that you can't know what the Council teaches on any one topic without looking at all of the documents together. So Father Dale Launderville and Father Anthony Ruff and Sean and myself sat down and we thought about what would be the appropriate thread to unite our lecture series, our investigation of these 4 documents. And early in our conversations, Father Dale Launderville suggested ecumenism, how the Council treated the issue of Christian unity. This seemed incredibly fitting because Christian unity was at the very heart of Vatican II. Pope John surprised the world by calling the Council at a service honoring the Octave for Christian Unity. This theme was also incredibly fitting because it fits well with St. John's University, the Abbey, and the School of Theology, and St. Benedict's monasteries' commitment to ecumenical dialogue. This lecture series is fitting because it represents how St. John's and St. Ben's are at the forefront of many of the theological developments in the U.S., engaged in cutting-edge and important work. There's many undergraduates here tonight, and some of the undergrads don't always fully understand the way that St. John's played an enormous role in the development of Vatican II. It's impossible to pick up a true history of the Council without some mention of this place. This past summer, I attended the annual Catholic Theological Society of America conference. And as is customary, I had my name tag on that identified me as a professor at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict. And throughout the course of the conference, multiple people came up to me and they said, "I'd really like to come visit St. John's and St. Ben's because they do such interesting things there." Or, "I'd really like to come to St. John's because I've always really respected the way they do ecumenism." For me, this has affirmed the way that St. John's and St. Ben's is nationally known as a center of important, creative, and faith-filled work. And this lecture series stands as a part of that tradition. So just to look back for one moment, we've explored the Council's significance and its impact on ecumenism with a lecture by Massimo Fagioli, professor of St. Thomas and a leading expert on the Council, who began the series with a talk on the liturgy document, Sacrosanctum Concilium. We had a lecture from Bishop Dennis Madden, who was the president of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops Committee on Ecumenism and Interreligious Dialogue. He spoke to us on Lumen Gentium, the document on the church. Professor Elizabeth Grappi of Xavier University gave a wonderful presentation on the ecumenism document, Unitatis Redintegratio, and she did a wonderful oral history of the role of St. John's in the process of ecumenism that unfolded at the council. And last spring, we had Professor Harry Attridge of Yale University, who presented on Dei Verbum, Vatican II's document on Scripture. This lecture series with these amazing scholars, including our speaker tonight, has to stand out as just one more example of how St. John's and St. Ben's stands out as a leader in theological study and dialogue. As I was reflecting on this earlier today, in the last 2.5 years, there has been a great call for experts on the council to come and speak throughout the country because everyone wants to honor the 50th anniversaries of Vatican II. Every person that we asked to come and speak at this series said yes. I think that's a tribute to the place that St. John's and St. Ben's is really recognized as an important place where conversations on theology and its development happen. It's my great joy and honor tonight to welcome Dr. Timothy Matovina. We are very fortunate to have someone with us here tonight who has served the church in such interesting, important, and diverse ways. Dr. Matovina is professor of theology and co-director of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He received his Master's of Divinity from the Toronto School of Theology and his PhD from the Catholic University of America. He works in the area of theology and culture with a specialization in U.S. Catholic and U.S. Latino theology and religion. He's the author of many important books and articles. One of his most recent books, Latino Catholicism, Transformation in America's Largest Church, which was published by Princeton University Press, has received many prestigious awards, including the College Theology Society's Best Book Award, and first place from the Catholic Press Association Book Awards in the history category. Michael Sean Winters of the New Republic has said that Professor Matovina's book, quote, should be mandatory reading for all bishops, clergy, and lay leaders, and for anyone else who wants to understand the future of American Catholicism. Professor Matovina has received numerous competitive grants from nearly every major funding source that supports academic work in theology and religion, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Academy of Religion, and the Association of Theological Schools. He has used these resources to advance the study of the changing dynamics in the church and practical aspects of some of the most important issues in the Christian community today. Professor Matovina is also a beloved teacher, the recipient of 2 teaching awards, and I know from my time at Notre Dame that his classes are among the first to fill on the first day of registration. I know Professor Matovina well as a friend, a colleague, and my former boss. In addition to being a world-class scholar and teacher, he's a supportive colleague who has a great sense of humor and is dedicated to his family. 2 quick things stand out to me about Professor Matovina from working closely with him. The first is that he is universally respected in the world of theology by people from across the theological spectrum. His intelligence, pragmatism, and real love for the church allow him to bring people together in dialogue, something that, as Pope Francis has emphasized, is so desperately needed in our church today. The second thing is I see Professor Matovina as someone who understands theology and all its academic intricacies, but is always profoundly concerned about how theological realities impact the actual lives of men and women. This bridging between academic theology and the pastoral life of the church is another thing our church needs desperately today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Matovina.
Thank you, Kristen. That was lovely. I want to thank Sean and Kristen for the invitation and everyone who was part of putting this together. It's also great to be with other Notre Dame graduates, Annie and Patrick McGowan. It was great to be back with them, and with my good friend Rebecca Brewer Davis and her husband Jeff, and for everyone, thanks so much. I cannot say sincerely and emphatically enough what an honor it is to be part of this lecture series. Anybody who knows Collegeville knows that Vatican II started here before there was a Vatican II, and that this place has been a nurturer of the council itself, of the vision, the living out of the council ever since, and into the future will be some more. Being here today, a lot of places, including the one where I work now, we talk about Catholic mission and identity, and we work hard at it. This place, just walking around here today, the stones shout out Catholic identity. The monastic-looking hallways in the classrooms, the sense of community, the beautiful testimonies of your students tonight, the warmth and hospitality, of course, of the monks and of the whole community. It's kind of like the beauty of Benedictinism just exudes throughout this place, and it really is just wonderful to be here. I felt like I was on retreat today, just walking around and meeting people. So I cannot be thankful enough for the chance to be here and be part of this. And I want to start with my favorite Vatican II joke, which I hope not everyone has already heard. If you have, please raise your hand and stop me. So the story goes, within a few years after the council, as the liturgy and other things were changing, one day a priest was preparing for Mass in the sacristy, and a firefighter comes to the door of the sacristy and says, "Father, we have an emergency here and we need your help immediately." He said, "Well, what is it?" He says, "Well, there's an electrical fire. And because it's an electrical fire, no one in the church knows the grave danger they're in, but we need to evacuate this church in the next 3 minutes, and it's packed. We can't yell fire, there's going to be a stampede. We've got to evacuate this church." He says, "I got it." So the priest grabs the altar servers and unexpectedly to the choir goes racing up the aisle. They get half a verse in, he flags them down. He turns to the congregation and says, "The Lord be with you. The Mass is ended, let us go in peace." Thanks be to God. And he grabs the altar servers and he goes running out again. And the people are looking around saying, "What was that?" But of course, hey, they got other things to do. There's football, coffee and donut hour. Yeah, but they grab themselves and start walking out of church. And everyone's happy, except these two elderly couple sitting in the very last row with their rosaries and their missals out. And one turns to the other and says, "I was born a Catholic, I've always been a Catholic, and I plan to die a Catholic. And there's nothing they're going to do is going to keep me away from going to Mass on Sunday. But if those priests change one more thing," how we all met the council. I'll begin with a little bit of a somewhat lengthy introduction tonight, occupying part of the talk. What do we mean by Vatican II? I presume I've watched a few of the previous lectures in the series that are on the website. I presume you've been thinking about this a bit, but let me talk about what I mean. And I'm taking a lot of this from my professor of Vatican II, really a giant in the field, Father Joe Komanchek, who I had at Catholic University, who was a seminarian in Rome at the time of the council and is one of its major interpreters. And he says, when we think about Vatican II, what do we mean by the term? And he means at least three things by it. Vatican II is about texts, experience, and event. Texts, experience, and event. Of course, the text is the first and the easiest thing to understand. The council met, as everyone knows, for 4 years, from 62 to 65. For those who were undergraduates, they didn't meet every day for 4 solid years. It was 3 months or so each fall, and the bishops had to go home and run their diocese. But over time, they met for 4 years, and they produced 16 texts, mostly about the life, the mission, and the inner renewal of the church and the outer renewal of the church. So one way we study Vatican II, and one meaning of the council is the text, of course. That's the primary teaching that we have that comes forth, and not just the texts. And again, for the students here that may be new to some of this, you don't just read the 16 texts, you read the minutes of the meeting and kind of the debates and discussions that the bishops and the experts were having about the text, the interventions, all that information is available. And so you can read the final wording, but how did they get to the final wording? What were the bishops talking about that made them choose one way of proceeding or one way of wording something as opposed to another? So there's a lot of textual analysis. And that is the teaching that the council hands down, the texts. But there's a second meaning of the council, and all of these, of course, are intimately related. They're not separate. They're all related to one reality that we call Vatican II, and that is the experience. And by this I mean the experience of the conciliar events. This refers then to all those, the two popes, John the 23rd and Paul the 6th, the bishops, advisors, observers, including Protestant observers, women observers, Paridi experts, and others, who were involved in the conciliar events themselves from January 25th, 1959, when Pope John the 23rd announced the convening of the council, to December 8th, 1965, when Paul the 6th solemnly closed it. So this experience of the council is another meaning and important element of it. And if those of you who are old enough to have known bishops who attended the council, it had profound impact. Today, those who were not around in the time of the council, you can read the memoirs of people who were there. And not just what the documents said, but what the people experienced, what it meant to them, how it transformed them. That's part of the meaning of Vatican II. So how did that experience of the conciliar meetings, the conciliar time, shape the lives of those participants, their formulation of the council documents, and their subsequent efforts to live out the meaning of the council in their dioceses, in their ministries, in their lives as Catholics? So the texts and the actual experience of the council. And then thirdly, the council as event. And by this, I don't just mean the event of the council itself, but the event of the entire conciliar era. This encompasses then the effect, the impact of Vatican II on the subsequent history of the Catholic Church, and indeed the subsequent history of the world, of global history. Vatican II is, even for those who are not Catholic, even for those who are not Christian, is still an important global event. This is the world's largest and oldest religious institution, confronting modernity head-on in a way that it had not done up till that point, seeking to renew itself from within, seeking to redefine and reconsider its relationship to the world. And no matter who you are in the world, when 1/6 of the people in this globe sharing a common religion engage in this rapid of a kind of a transformation and renewal of its own religious body, that's a global event. And indeed, Vatican II is probably the most important, I would argue it is the most important religious event of the 20th century. So it's an event, it's a global event, an ecclesial event, it's a world event. 50 years hence, it is still too early to grasp with any depth the meaning of the council as an event. Sean has already said that, and Kristen was just intimating it. We're just beginning to evaluate the meaning of this event for the long history of the church and of the world. As Joseph Kamanchik himself noted, and I'm quoting now, simply contrasting continuity and discontinuity in the interpretation of the council is a dead end. And there's been a tendency to do that, especially as we've looked back at the council over these last years, to simply say continuity versus discontinuity. While that is something that's worthy of discussion, in some ways it's just a dead end. The council is far more impactful than just this narrow interpretation or that narrow interpretation. We need, therefore, broader analysis of the council as an event in church history, but also in global history. And again, we're just beginning to do this. I'm part of a project at Notre Dame that we're working on called The Lived History of Vatican II. And what we're trying to do, and it's just an initial attempt, we're not trying to settle anything. We're trying to launch a trajectory of research that we hope many others will pick up on. We've gotten authors from 15 countries around the world, or 15 dioceses, I should say, representing all continents. And it's only a minimal selection. We got 15 to work with. We've asked each one to write on the history of some important aspect of one Catholic diocese during the Vatican II era, roughly the 60s and the 70s. Some of them go into the early 80s, depending on the particular history of that diocese. How did the council interact, we asked them, with a particular local place, church, and context? And it's fascinating to hear, especially from those that are not from Europe or the United States or Canada, those from Africa and Asia and Latin America, some of the unintended consequences of the council. I'm just going to give one example. One of our researchers is working on a small diocese, middle-sized diocese in India. And this particular person is looking at the liturgy and how the liturgy was transformed and transformative of that local diocese. Of course, for most of us in the West, the liturgy, moving into the vernacular, led to all sorts of changes and sometimes arguments between so-called more traditionalists and more progressives and so on, Latin versus English, these kinds of arguments. And we can tend to think in the West, well, this is what happened with the Sacrosancto Concilium. It produced these kinds of discussions and these kinds of changes and these kinds of concerns among Catholic people around the world as the Mass moved into vernacular. Well, in this Indian diocese, there happened to be, at the time of the council, two main dialects that were spoken among the local people who were Catholic in that diocese. The minority dialect, that spoken by a lower number of people, happened to also be the dialect that most of the priests spoke. And the majority dialect, that is the one that more people spoke, was more prevalent among the laity. Well, it's not entirely clear why they didn't just have Mass in both of these languages, as sometimes happens here. We'll have Mass in multiple languages. Of course, there weren't a lot of Catholics. This was not in southern India, it's more Catholic. It was an area where Catholicism was not the majority religion. So they went for just one of the two dialects or languages, and they chose the one that the clergy spoke, which led to 25 years of protests and wrangling between laity and clergy, not between Latin and the common language. In fact, Latin settled down ethnic rivalries because it was nobody's language, so nobody got in a fight about it. But they began to fight over which of these two dialects was the right one. Now, I am almost certain there were very few bishops that were at the council that foretold this sort of a consequence of putting the Mass in the vernacular. But it's one of those unintended consequences of Vatican II that deeply impacted the life of these Catholic people and their neighbors at a place around the globe. That's what we're studying in our study, how the event of the council had all sorts of consequences, intended and unintended, that indeed we are arguing are part of the history of the council itself. So, 3 big points. The Vatican Council is about texts, the 16 documents produced, and the context and the conversations that led to them. It's about experience, the actual experience of the conciliar events of all the participants, and the event, the impact of the council on communities and on places and the actions of the church in places around the globe. None of these are interrelated. They're all 3 interrelated elements of the one event, of the one experience, of the one movement in the church we call Vatican II. So it's important to remember that there were topics that were developed only briefly in the conciliar texts, but came to have a much greater importance in the wake of the council. And tonight we're going to look at one of those, the option for the poor. Those words do not appear in Gaudium et Spes as such, and they don't appear anywhere in the documents of Vatican II. And yet, this idea of the option for the poor has become a moving and important concept, not only in theology, but in the life of the church in many places, Latin America first, and then many other places besides. And so how can we talk about, I want to say for a minute, how can we talk about the option for the poor as part of Vatican II when, in fact, the words don't even appear in the documents? Poverty, of course, was spoken of at the council. At the end of the first session, in fact, Cardinal Lucaro of Bologna proposed that the entire agenda of the council should focus on the church as the church of the poor and for the poor. And a relatively small group of bishops met regularly in Rome throughout the council to urge that this matter get further consideration. In the end, they had only a slight effect on the conciliar documents. There's a brief reference to the poor in Lumen Gentium, and as we'll see as we'll go over it tonight, the problem of economic inequality and other aspects of poverty are noted in Gaudium et Spes. But the treatment of poverty is rather minimal when compared to what this group of the poor, these bishops who were advocating for this, actually wanted done. Nonetheless, what happened in Latin America, based on Gaudium et Spes, based on the council, brought this concept into the conciliar history of the church. Okay, I finished my introduction. Now I want to turn to a second point and talk about Gaudium et Spes and the option for the poor. And I want to use that introduction to think about this topic, because I want to talk about text, experience, and event, and how it relates to Gaudium et Spes and the option for the poor as it came to be defined in Latin America. So I'm not going to go in the same order. I want to start with experience first. What was the experience of the Latin American bishops at the council? Well, one of the most outspoken members of the hierarchy of Latin America was Brazilian Bishop Dom Helder Câmara, who contended, as is famously known, he's a very famous person in the council and following, he contended that poverty and economic development were the primary issues facing the church in the world. Of course, living in abject poverty among his own people in Brazil, this was a rather expected, almost a sort of point of view that he would bring. On the whole, however, although there were approximately 600 bishops from Latin America participating in the council and 300 periti, or theological advisors, from Latin America, they didn't have all that great of an impact on the council, which was largely followed the agenda of European and other Western bishops. The council for them was rather a time of learning and formation, and indeed, CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, they even held their annual meeting in the Vatican in conjunction with the council, for convenience in some ways, because they sort of said, well, we're all going to be there anyway. Why don't we just go a few days early or stay a few days late or take one of the weekends, and they would hold their annual bishops' meetings in Rome. But this experience then really impacted them. Bishops who didn't really know one another or hadn't seen one another in a long time, as was the case with all the bishops at the council, came closer together. And so that experience for the Latin American bishops at the council itself was one of formation and building stronger unity among themselves, and led to the developments that came afterwards. When the Latin American bishops then met at Medellin in 1968, and they met explicitly to discuss how they would live out the Second Vatican Council in their dioceses and throughout Latin America, they had spent the years of the council and since the council getting to know one another, reflecting intensely together, and honing their socioeconomic analyses of the poverty on their continent. Thus, the experience of the council and its wider implications as an event can be seen in how the council shaped the church in Latin America in the 5 decades since the closing of the final session. The influence of Gaudium et Spes in Latin America is perhaps most conspicuously seen in the 4 major meetings of the Latin American bishops since Vatican II: Medellin, 1968, Puebla in 79, Santo Domingo in 1992, and Aparecida in 2007. And if you read those documents, you can see how the bishops have progressively encouraged one another and Catholics and others throughout the continent to live out Vatican II. So that's the experience of the council and how it led them to wider reflections based on the council and their continent. What about the texts? So here, this is going to be one of the longer parts of the talk. I want to get, what does Gaudium et Spes actually say about poverty, and how did that lead the bishops of Latin America to develop their teachings on poverty? So if you've gotten the handout for tonight, I invite you to turn to it. And I've put a number of texts on that handout. You'll notice they're not in chronological order by numbers, but they're in the order I'm going to present them in this presentation. So if you start from the bottom and work down, I'm going to deal with the text one by one. So Gaudium et Spes. First of all, and by the way, I use the Vatican translation, the official translation. I will read them in a more inclusive manner as I read through the particular text that I'm going to point to tonight. But on the paper itself, I use the actual Vatican translation. So I think we all know this, but for the sake of those who want to be reminded or maybe are not as familiar with this material, the first line of Gaudium et Spes, of course, is the most famous and the most quoted, and it's there on your sheet. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially of those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. A very important line. The church is not just about what goes on within the church. The church is about the world. This is the pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world. And whatever causes anxiety or pain, wherever there is poverty or suffering, there is the mission and the business of the church. We're not always all we're supposed to be in those areas, but that's our intention, and that's our mission given to the church by Christ, to be a leaven, an agent, a mission, a sacrament in the world. So a beautiful line about the church's relationship to the world. The next quotes on there aren't really about poverty per se, but I just want to point out, actually this was a question that came up at lunch today. It's amazing how timely this document reads 50 years later. Not just in its theology, but in the issues it points to. I mean, 50 years ago, who was thinking about this stuff? Now it's regular, it's kind of commonplace. 50 years ago, the bishops were way ahead of themselves. So I've got a quote there from number 5, which I would say, they don't use the word, but it's on globalization. The destiny of the human community has become all of a piece, where once the various groups of people had a kind of private history of their own. So we're living in an interconnected world. Now, everybody knows that today. It's a global world. Who knew it so profoundly 50 years ago? I mean, the bishops really were in tune with the world they were trying to address. Another one on number 79, the next quote there on the page, on terrorism. In many causes, the use of terrorism is regarded as a new way to wage war. God, how prophetic is that? Who was talking about that 50 years ago? Vietnam was just starting up, and they were so far ahead of themselves. So this is a very timely document. We are going to be looking at what it taught about poverty. That's only one of the many deep and profound topics addressed. We simply don't have time tonight to hit all of them. But let's move on to speak a bit about poverty. What does the document say? In an overview way, there are several major points about poverty in Gaudium et Spes. There's a stress on the unequal distribution of the world's resources. Again, how timely is that in our own day in the United States? Looking at these young college students. My own son, my youngest, is a senior in high school, getting ready to go away to college. And I look at, the job prospects. When I was the age of the college students, if you got out with a college degree, there was a good job waiting for you, probably with some kind of health insurance and a chance to have a decent living. Now, people can graduate from college. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but you really got to work to get a job. What kind of a world have we created for our young people? And while some are getting much richer, the middle is shrinking. And this distribution of the world's wealth is a real concern that the bishops hit very strongly 50 years ago in Gaudium et Spes. A call to engagement in charity among Christians and all people of goodwill. And I know this series is about ecumenism. You'll notice that in this area of service for justice, service for the poor, is one of the most ecumenical areas of the churches and of the council. It's hard to talk about whether you should baptize infants or adults. Lots of theological commissions have tried to work on ecumenical conversations about these important issues. When it comes to what are you going to do about poverty in your city, how are you going to serve a suffering child, ecumenism is much more easily served. We're going to get together, or we should get together, and we ought to work together in the name of Christ. And indeed, if there have been achievements in ecumenism since the council, many of them, including in Latin America, which I'm addressing in this talk tonight, have occurred in the area of making an option for the poor, service for justice, fighting for justice, because the churches see our creeds may be different in some ways, but our call to be the church in the world is a common call to all the churches. And the council speaks eloquently of that. And in fact, I think it's one of the stronger areas of ecumenical activity over the last half century. Gaudium et Spes also talks about analysis of specific topics like workers' rights, the right to migrate, investments, and private property. So there are various ways where wealth and poverty are addressed in the council document. Let's move on to some specific texts. And on your sheet there now, there's right in the middle, number 63, that very long quote. The first line of that quote. Many people, it says, especially in economically advanced areas, seem, as it were, to be ruled by economics, so that almost their entire personal and social life is permeated with a certain economic way of thinking. Very powerful teaching, and again, still very timely even 50 years later. Economics, for some, we've heard sermons about this, materialism, consumerism. It's as if economics is the measure and the test of our life, or the focus of our life, leading some to be so focused on this that others, of course, suffer. But even those who are so focused and maybe have the material things they need can develop a kind of a spiritual poverty because the economic becomes the overriding focus of human life. The same quote, going further, just a few lines from the bottom, just a short phrase. It speaks about contempt for the poor. Contempt for the poor. The bishops, U.S. bishops, in their economic pastoral of 1985 spoke of this beautifully as well. How often do we blame the poor themselves for their poverty? Not that sometimes it's not, the lack of a willingness to work or self-chosen cycles that lead to poverty. That happens. But that's not the only cause of poverty. And often there's a tendency to look contemptuously at the poor and sort of blame them for the situation they're in and deny, in a certain sense, their very humanity. And the council there speaks out against this in this expression there. And then the sentence after that, while an immense number of people still lack the absolute necessities of life, some, even in less advanced areas, live in luxury or squander wealth. There, a profound critique, prophetic statement of the income inequality. And anybody who's traveled in Latin America, you see this sometimes. People living in tremendous wealth, and right next to them, hovels of people who don't even have food sufficient to eat, right next to one another, where it's even more kind of demonstrably noticeable. So I'm just pointing out here some of the text, what the council actually said about poverty in these texts. Jumping to the next one, number 71, the very last line of that quote. Insufficiently cultivated estates should be distributed to those who can make these lands fruitful. Here is a text that many in Latin America resonated with very directly. There were many pushes, led by Catholic leaders, for land reforms in Latin America after the council, looking at these very kind of texts, which says, why should some fields be left fallow because there's a profit motive for not over-flooding the market with a certain crop, when there are farmers who want to work and whose land has been taken away, and all they want is to do subsistence farming. So the council very clearly pointed out this situation that was not only in Latin America, it was other places as well, and called for remedies. The next one, number 72, the beautiful line there towards the end. The work of justice under the inspiration of charity. This is, by the way, the last line in the chapter of Gaudium and Spes that's titled Economic and Social Life. It's the very last text in that major section of the document on economic and social life. The work of justice under the inspiration of charity. And here is something else. It's 50 years later, it's still very timely. Of course, this is always timely because this is Catholic teaching. Pope Benedict, in his encyclical on hope, actually treated this very beautifully, explained it very profoundly. He said justice actually comes before charity. Justice is giving each one their due. Every human being, by virtue of being a creation of God, a creature made in God's image and likeness, every human being has the right to the necessities of life: food, shelter, being treated with dignity, and so on. So justice requires that we as societies, and certainly us as Christians and as Catholics, try to see to it that each human person has the necessities of life, what they need. Each one should receive what is their due by virtue of being human beings created by God. That's justice. Justice is meeting the minimum, providing what is needed for survival. We can't always accomplish this, but it is our responsibility to do all we can to make sure that's the case for every human being on the planet. Charity goes beyond justice and fulfills it. Justice is doing what is required. Charity is saying, we've already done what is required. Now we go beyond justice. Now, out of gratitude to God, because every good gift we have comes from God alone, we go on what is required and we give in an overflowing desire to just simply share more with others. So justice is the first and required step. Charity is the perfection of justice, because it goes beyond what is minimal and required to give from the gratitude of our heart and our desire to share with our sisters and with our brothers. It doesn't spell this out in as many words, but that's the Catholic teaching that underlies that line there and that teaching of Gaudium et Spes. The next line I just simply put in as a reminder of something beautiful that's said. The greater part of the world is still suffering from so much poverty that it is as if Christ himself were crying out in these poor to beg the charity of the disciples. This is the mysticism of working and serving among our sisters and brothers who have less than us, that in them we see the very face of Christ. A beautiful reflection of the council. So social action, again, as I said earlier, is a most fertile field for ecumenical activity and the building of ecumenical relations. The council brings this out in number 88, also quoted there at the very bottom of the first page of your handout. The last line there says, wherever it seems convenient, this activity of Catholics, that is service to the poor and the needy, should be carried on in unison with all other Christians, And so the council here is, in fact, explicitly inviting us to make social action not just a Catholic action, but an ecumenical action in the name of Christ and on behalf of our sisters and brothers of all backgrounds, all faiths, or no faith at all. So the council in Gaudium et Spes, I've just tried to outline some of the teachings about poverty. I hope you get a general sense of what Gaudium et Spes was saying. Let's move on now. That is then the text of the council, what it actually said. So we've done the experience of the Latin American bishops at the council and the other participants from Latin America. We've done something on the text of Gaudium et Spes itself and what it says about poverty. Now let's move to the council as event. How were these teachings and this experience of the bishops at Vatican II and of the text of Gaudium et Spes, how did that lead to a wider expression of the conciliar event in the living out of the council in Latin America? Well, we turn, and it's on the opposite page of your handout now, to some of the key texts in Medellin and then at Puebla. Medellin, of course, is a pivotal text. It's trying to look at the meaning of the event of Vatican II and how it intersects with the Latin American reality. A well-remembered event. By the way, I just was invited to go to Medellin in 2018, so the 50th anniversaries aren't over yet. They said, we're going to have a 50th anniversary of Medellin, which I think is going to be a great event. Those of you who are into this kind of stuff, mark your calendars. There's going to be an event in Medellin probably in September of 2018 to mark the 50th anniversary of that event. I don't know whether 50th anniversaries are coming up, but Vatican II's got a long shadow, so we're going to keep thinking and remembering what the council means to us and trying to live it out. Medellin was pivotal, and that text there deserves to be read in full. The Latin American bishops, it says, cannot remain indifferent in the face of the tremendous social injustices existent in Latin America, which keep the majority of our peoples in dismal poverty, which in many cases becomes inhuman wretchedness. A deafening cry pours from the throats of millions, asking their pastors for a liberation that reaches them from nowhere else. A poetic, prophetic, and powerful text about what the bishops saw when they looked out after Vatican II at the poverty, the wealth of the few, and the poverty of the many that marked so many of the societies across Latin America. This led them in Puebla to continue to develop their idea and to more explicitly speak of the option for the poor. And the next text on your handout really speaks to this quite directly. The final lines say that Medellin adopted a clear and prophetic option expressing preference for and solidarity with the poor. Jesus, the document says, made a preferential option to serve the poor, not an exclusive, but a preferential option. And the church, the document says there, is called not just to serve the poor, but to accompany the poor and to be in solidarity with the poor. So an intensification of what Gaudium et Spes said. The option for the poor, by the way, sometimes this is a misunderstood topic. I have the pleasure of teaching with Gustavo Gutierrez at Notre Dame, who of course is the founder of liberation theology, a big theological figure, I think the most important theologian of the 20th century. And the way he talks about it is this: God loves everyone. But like a parent, a mother who has 5 children, and one of those children has special needs, And the mother lavishes special attention on that child, not because she doesn't love the others with all her heart, but because that's the child who needs her the most. And God's preferential love for the poor is that sort of a love. God loves everyone, but the ones who are most needy, those who are living this most wretched and dehumanizing condition, as is spoken of there in the document, God's love kind of overflows in a special kind of a way. Recall that in the book of Exodus, it doesn't say God heard the cries of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt, or God heard the prayers. It said God heard the cries. God's first response to Israel is a response to the cries of the enslaved, the cries of the oppressed, not even their prayers. They weren't even in a position to even ask. But God hears the cries. And this is the God of the Scriptures that Puebla and Medellin and the Latin American Bishops' Conference and the theologians and the lay people of Latin America have tried to bring out. So it's this not just service for the poor, not just charity, but solidarity, walking with them, making their cause your own, asking the causes of poverty, and taking prophetic stances that address it. The next text, the last one on the page there, is also from Puebla. And this speaks very beautifully of the poor themselves in a way that I think picks up on Gaudium et Spes, but actually deepens it in what it says about the poor. It says there, commitment to the poor and oppressed and the rise of grassroots communities have helped the church to discover the evangelizing potential of the poor. For the poor challenge the church constantly, summoning its conversion. And many of the poor incarnate in their lives the evangelical values of solidarity, service, simplicity, and openness to accepting the gift of God. So the poor are called to conversion like everyone else. All of us are called to be transformed. That's the meaning of the gospel, to have our lives transformed and make our lives more like that of Christ. But the poor also challenge the church to conversion. That is, those of us who work within and lead the church. The poor challenge us to see the gospel once again and its radical implications for what it means to be Christians in the world and to be involved in the griefs and anxieties of the world, as the very first line of Gaudium et Spes says. So the poor are not just recipients of the church's ministry. They are not just recipients of the church's aid. The poor are members of the church. They're members of the body of Christ. They are our fellow journeyers on the pilgrimage of life, and they call us to conversion, and us, those of us who are not poor, to a greater solidarity, to a greater living out of the gospel in imitation of the virtues that we can see in their lives. I see heads nodding, and I am guessing that a lot of the nodding heads are people who have worked in Latin America or have ministered many years among the poor and say, yes, I've had that very experience. It certainly has been mine. I want to kind of bring this all together by speaking about one biblical text. And I'm kind of winding down now. If you've kind of drifted out because I'm a little boring as a professor, I'm coming to a climactic moment now. So, if you're getting ready to tune back in, this is the time to do it. You could pick up almost everything I tried to say before in the next 5 minutes if you listen intently. The Good Samaritan. We all know this text from the Gospel of Luke. The Good Samaritan. I remember my Irish pastor growing up in Gary, Indiana. He gave a sermon that I've heard 100 times about this. This was in the late 60s. I was in high school at the time. We were involved in search retreats, my buddies and I, at the Catholic high school we went to. And we used to wear these big crosses that you got at the end of it. It was like a Cursillo research retreat. They were made out of railroad ties, and they were big, And Our old Irish priest, he was not used to seeing young people wearing crosses, He wanted us to be more involved in our Catholic faith, and actually the way we talked about Jesus kind of scared him a little bit. He wanted a little bit more subdued spirituality. And he saw us wearing these crosses, and it kind of made him a little nervous. And one Sunday was the Good Samaritan. And he started talking about how when he was young, growing up in his Irish neighborhood, my Irish grandmother was sitting next to me, and she confirmed what he said. He said, when I was growing up, there used to be a saying in my neighborhood. I don't know if some of the people are old enough to remember this saying. The saying was, let George do it. It's what you said, it's what you said to your parents when you were walking along and your mother said, hey, pick up that wrapper there. And you say, well, I didn't throw the wrapper there. Let George do it. And the mother would say, well, no, you go pick it up. Let George do it. That's not my responsibility. I didn't mess it up. I shouldn't have to fix it. So Father was telling us about this experience, let George do it, and how his mother taught him. And he said, he says, a lot of you young people are wearing those big crosses around. He says, if you really want to wear something that shows you're Christians and followers of Jesus Christ, take those crosses off. What you need is a big button. Put it right here, a big button that says, I'm George. And then he went on to talk to us about, being a Christian means being a good Samaritan, being the one that gets in there and helps when no one else is not helping, doing the deeds that no one else seems to want to do. It was a beautiful sermon. And in many ways, it encapsulates a lot of the teachings of Gaudium at Spes. We should be the ones out in the world serving. We should be the first in line. We should be the Samaritans of the world today. That's a beautiful teaching. But in Latin America, this text, I think, was lived out in that way, but in an even more profound way. And it took the teachings of Gaudium at Spes, the Latin American church did, and extended it further. Here's another way of thinking about the Good Samaritan. The first one was right on. It was really good. Father Duty, my pastor, he had it, man. He got us. Here it is, 35, 40, what is it, more than 50, it's almost 50 years later. I'm still quoting his sermon, so it must have been a pretty good sermon. How many of you remember the sermon you heard last Sunday? No, I shouldn't ask that. I was at a beautiful mass today here, and I remember that sermon. But 50 years later, that sermon's still with me. It was great. But here's how they looked at this text in Latin America. The story of the Good Samaritan, of course, is told in a particular context. A lawyer comes to Jesus, and he asks him, Lord, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? And Jesus says, well, you know the scriptures. What do you read? He's a good teacher. He turns it back on him, And the lawyer responds, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you are right. Do this and you shall live. Now, the lawyer gave a great answer. In fact, as you know, there's only one other person in the entire Bible that brings the two great commandments together. His name begins with a J. Jesus himself. The lawyer is the only other one that kind of put that together for himself. So Jesus says, very good. Do this and you shall live. But the lawyer wished to justify himself. And so he asked, but Lord, who is my neighbor? Now, if you study the scriptures, this was not an uncommon question in Jesus' day. A lot of the rabbis, and you can read this rabbinic literature the time before or after, even the actual time of Jesus, and many of them were asked, who's the neighbor? What do you have to do? What's the minimum to fulfill the commandment? And some of them said, well, a neighbor is anyone from your clan, from your extended family. Some went further and said it's anyone from your tribe in Israel. Some went so far as to say it's any fellow Israelite. Well, they're all kind of different answers of what you had to do to fulfill that commandment. And so the lawyer was asking a question that many teachers, like Jesus, would have been asked. But once again, Jesus doesn't give a straight answer. And this time, instead of giving a question back, he tells a story. And of course, we know the story. The priest and the Levite go by. Finally, it's the Samaritan, the one who helps the victim. And I think most of you probably know who the Samaritans were. They had intermarried after the time of the Assyrian conquest of northern Israel. So they were considered impure. No self-respecting Jew, certainly a lawyer, would have wanted to commune or even to brush shoulders with a Samaritan. They were considered impure. So the Samaritan is a very unlikely hero. It's sort of like today it might be an AIDS victim. Who would you allow to help you if you were in trouble along the snowy road in northern Minnesota? Well, the most unlikely person you could think of would be a welcome sight if you were suffering in the road. So that's the way the story goes. But stories, of course, are powerful vehicles for teaching because they invite us to identify with a character in the story. Why do you cry at one of your most moving movies? Well, at some level, you need to ask yourself, who do I identify with that's making me weep at this movie? Something in there is touching some chord inside of identification. So who might the lawyer identify with in this story? The lawyer says, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells him a story. Well, certainly the lawyer does not want to identify with the priest or the Levite. After all, they're the anti-heroes. They did not do the right thing. They walked by. And it's not very probable that the lawyer is going to identify with the Samaritan either. Lawyers would have thought Samaritans were the lowest rung of the social ladder, and lawyers were above that. So in fact, if the lawyer does not identify with the priest or the Levite or even the Samaritan, who is left for him to identify with? The victim, the man in the ditch. And in fact, that seems precisely to be what the Lord is teaching him in that parable. Because the lawyer's question is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus' question is, who was neighbor to the man who fell by the road? Well, the lawyer says, the man who helped him. Then go and do likewise. The radical meaning of this parable, and of course any parable, those of you who have studied Scripture, you know, one of the most important ways to read a parable is, what's the unexpected, shocking twist in the parable? That's how you read a parable. You know the parable of the good shepherd. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one, would not abandon the 99 and go look for the lost sheep? You know that one? Of course, what's shocking about this, any of you who are business majors will know this, which one of you would leave the 99? None of us. Are you out of your mind? The 99 sheep is the flock. You can't leave the 99. You write the one sheep off on your income taxes, and you stay with the 99. Jesus asks this like it's self-evident. It's shocking to the shepherds and farmers who are listening to Jesus in Galilee saying, what do you mean, which one of us? What's shocking, of course, and that's the key to the parable, is the shocking mercy of God, or the feminine image of God that's in the very next text in Matthew. What woman, having 10 coins, losing one, would not sweep the entire house until she found her lost coin and then spend all she had to have a big party for all her neighbors? There's no capitalism in that parable. I found my penny. Let's spend every last dime of our savings and have a party. It's a shocking parable about the joy in heaven over one repentant sinner. So what's shocking about the parable of the Good Samaritan? What's shocking is the lawyer is being asked to position himself not as the one doing the helping, but as the victim in the ditch. What Jesus invites, indeed demands of the lawyer, is what in fact he demands of us in this parable. When you ask, who is my neighbor? When you ask, what does it mean to be a Christian in the world today? When you ask, who is God in my life? When you ask, what is my vocation? Don't ask it as the powerful looking down on the rest of the world. Put yourself in the ditch with the victims of the world and ask the very same questions and find what the Lord has to say to you. When the lawyer wants to know who is my neighbor, what he's really asking is, who do I have to help? How far does this circle extend that I've got to do this much to fulfill the commandment? And Jesus' answer is, put yourself in the place of the world's victims. Put yourself in the ditch, and then ask, who is my neighbor? From the ditch, even the Samaritan, the most low-class, undesirable, because of prejudice, discriminated against person the lawyer could imagine, that one is also your neighbor. They're all your neighbor. The option for the poor does not just a call to do charitable acts to help the poor. It's not even just a call to analyze economic injustice and try to find its root causes. It's all of that. But it's something far more profound as it's been developed in the Latin American church and a gift of the Latin American church to the rest of us. It's the request, the recommendation, and indeed the demand that we put ourselves in the position of the world's victims, not just to sympathize with them, and certainly not to feel guilty that we're not down there ourselves now. Guilt doesn't help anybody. That kind of unhealthy guilt doesn't help anybody. But to ask our theological questions, our faith questions, our questions of discipleship, always from the perspective of the poor. In a word, what I've tried to say to you tonight is Gaudium et Spes spoke to us of the responsibilities of our church and ourselves as believers in the modern world, including the poverty of the world. The event of Vatican II, its ongoing unfolding in Latin America and beyond Latin America and other places as well have taught us that what Gaudium et Spes is leading us to is an option for the poor that should affect every aspect of our Christian lives. As we try to take on in our prayer life the vision, the eyes of Christ, we should try to take on in our ministerial and our prayer life as well the vision of the poor. Because when we see the world from the perspective of the poor, we are much closer to seeing it from the perspective of the Lord himself. Final point. I was asked about Pope Francis, and I want to end talking about Pope Francis. I'm going to shoehorn Pope Francis. I actually think he fits very well. I'm also going to do this. I just love Pope Francis. I had a student pray in my class recently. I did a little prayer at the beginning of class, and I said, anybody have any intentions? And she says, well, I heard a prayer last night at one of the dorm masses at Notre Dame. And she says, can I repeat the prayer? I said, sure. Her prayer was, may our Lord give Pope Francis the health to live 150 years. Let us pray to the Lord. And I knew who the priest was immediately. I said, that was Father Joe Capora, wasn't it? She says, how did you know that? I said, that's how the guy prays. I know that man. So 50 years after the council, we have our first ever pope from the Americas, our first Latin American pope. He's furthered the focus on the marginal peoples in the life of the church. I mentioned at the lunch today, Archbishop Tobin from Indianapolis gave a talk at Notre Dame this summer, and he spoke of a Methodist conference that took place in Indianapolis. He was invited to go by and visit with the Methodists at this big national conference of their bishops and their leadership, and he prayed with them and communed with them. And he was telling us about the theme of their conference. This is a Methodist conference. The theme was they were examining the teachings of Pope Francis under 3 titles, 3 M's: mercy, mission, and margins. I mean, not only did they, as Methodists, take up the teachings of Pope Francis, they captured them beautifully. Pope Francis has been talking to us about mercy. We're starting a year of mercy. They're meeting about mercy right now at the Synod in Rome. How does mercy relate to family life is one of the big questions. Mission, missionary disciples. We are not just called to serve in the sanctuary. We're called to be in the world. And margins, the encounter of Christ in the margins. We've got to be out in the margins. I want a church that spells the sheep. All the things that the Pope's been saying. This Methodist conference captured it beautifully. Pope Francis, of course, is deeply influenced by Teología del Pueblo, the theology of the people, which is a model of theological reflection and pastoral action that focuses on everyday people as the recipients and the agents of evangelization. So what I'm trying to finish with is this. Pope Francis, in my view, is part of the event of Vatican II. We've now got a Latin American pope who is furthering the way I've talked about how the event of Gaudium et Spes was furthered in Latin America. We've now got a pope who's giving voice to that throughout the church and teaching all of us about mission, about mercy, and about margins. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, excuse me. So we have a few moments for some question and answers. I invite people to raise your hand, and we don't have any mics set up, but hopefully we'll be able to hear you. So, please.
I very much like your division into the events, the text, and the experience. One suggestion I had thinking about it in your research, you said you're going to the diocese. Another way I think that you can explore that experience is from the actual people. There's the people born that really were in the church before Vatican II, those in the transition, and those who have come afterwards. Because I went back before coming to them, and I read the document the last couple of days, and it said we're going to dialogue with the church, we're going to dialogue with the other Christians, and we're going to dialogue with the non-believers in this big cultural unfolding. And as I reflected on it, it seemed to me that the unbelievers have really in some ways taken the storm, at least in the cultural milieu and many aspects of how our people are. And my thought in hearing your distinction was, well, maybe another way to begin the dialogue with those who have become unbelievers or have never been exposed is to think about Vatican II from the personal experience of those individuals. What is it that happened if you were born after Vatican II that was different about your experience in church, as opposed to the crisis of, well, they flipped the altar, they did other things. So it's less a question, it's more a suggestion, because I like very much how you divvied it up, and I thought it might be another way to think and look at it in seeking out other input for your work.
Everyone hear that okay? No? Well, he was suggesting, if I could repeat just a little piece of what you said, that, what about people who were not born at the council, so how, and the number of people who are not even believers today, how could the impact of the council be transmitted in some sort of way that will help them to capture some of the spirit of this? If I could just comment, I really like your point about, we need to talk a bit about the excitement of the council. We seem to kind of constantly be bickering about what it really meant and whether it was done right or not. For most of us who lived through the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of exciting things that came out of the renewal of our Catholic life. Certainly there are things that we might all want to critique in one way or the other. But for young people who have never, for whom it often sounds like the beginning of an argument between all those older Catholics, if we can capture some of that excitement, and the unbelievers too, if we're not enthusiastic about it, how are they ever going to even begin to listen to what we're talking about, since they're not inclined to talk about churchy things to begin with? So thank you, very good comment. I guess there's no microphones, so we have to be really, really loud so people can hear this. And we'll just do a few, and I am going to stay after so we can have one-on-one dialogue. So could you be real loud, please? Maybe you want to stand up even and belt it out.
Liberation theology seemed to speak a lot to some of the things you were talking about and fundamental options for the poor, especially in Latin America. But then the Vatican silenced Gutierrez, Bach, and those that were speaking for it. Why do you think that happened?
Okay, so the question is about the silencing or the comments from the Vatican on liberation theology. First of all, Gutierrez has never been silenced. He's never been taken out of any position he's ever had. Leonardo Boff is a slightly different case. I think you're referring to those statements that came out of the Doctrine for the Faith in the early 80s, which critiqued certain aspects of liberation theologies and their tendencies. They didn't actually condemn liberation theology. Pope John Paul spoke about liberation very freely in many cases afterwards, and those particular documents didn't explicitly kind of condemn anyone. It just sort of warned against tendencies that needed to be avoided. The response of some liberation theologians, including Father Gutierrez, was, we take these warnings very seriously, and if we see anyone doing that, we'll tell them to stop, because they didn't see themselves reflected in at least some, in fact, many of the critiques. So it's been, I think, in some ways, a much healthier conversation between the Vatican and liberation theologians than is sometimes perceived vis-a-vis those statements. In Father Gutierrez's case, for example, there's this false kind of presumption that the Vatican at some point, condemned one of his books or stopped him from teaching in a Catholic venue or so. Actually, that never has happened. He's always been in good graces. I can't see the hand, but whoever it is,
Yes, would you like to stand up?
please stand and speak strongly, whoever you are. I can't see.
Go ahead. Oddly enough, I happened to be at your talk in New York last Thursday.
Yeah,
on American Catholics, and as a challenge to the Church of the United States.
Are you following me or what?
It's great. I just wondered, you're reflecting on the impact of all of this on the hierarchy of Latin America, and here we have this tremendous influx of people from there. I don't know if you can draw some connections between that and the challenge, both on diocesan and parochial level, to us as a church in the United States.
Yeah, he's asking about Latinos that are now in the United States, which actually we had a very engaging conversation at lunch about that. That is my major topic of study, so thanks for bringing it up. This particular topic I was giving just so much lent itself to Medellin and Puebla, I went in this direction tonight. And I can only speak briefly about the other topic because it's so vast. But obviously, Latinos in the U.S. Catholic Church are a huge blessing and also change in the way all of us are living Catholicism. Is reaching places it's never been before. Latinos have been in Minnesota a long time, but the numbers are growing even more now. So this is a huge opportunity and change for the church. I think Latinos bring many elements, a deeply sacramental sense of the world, a deeply communitarian sense of the human person. I was talking about that in Kristen's class today. They also bring many needs. Many are recent immigrants and can benefit greatly from the educational formation opportunities that we have been so focused on for our lay and our clerical leaders in this church. So there's a great opportunity here for mutuality. Sometimes there's lots of misunderstanding in parishes and difficulties. The biggest change perhaps on the ground, 100 years ago in Catholicism in the United States, 2/3 of the parishes were national parishes that served one language or cultural group, the German parish, the Polish parish, the Italian parish, and so on. Now, today, 1/3 of our parishes in this country regularly have Mass in 2 or more languages. There's lots of reasons for that. Bishops have had to close inner-city churches of former immigrant groups. Not as many clergy, many more Catholics. Finances are difficult. So bishops have had to make tough choices. Sometimes churches get closed, and people can be very upset about that. The simple reality is that's probably the situation that we have to deal with in terms of pastoral life, but it's a huge change. Whereas we used to have national parishes for our immigrants, we now have shared parishes where people of different language groups are coming together, at least under the same roof. And that brings a great opportunity to be a sign of unity as the body of Christ in a very divided world. But it also brings challenges, because sometimes we're divided among ourselves in those very parishes as people try to work out how to live together. And I wish I had more time to speak about that, because it's a huge sort of topic. But I'm just going to leave it at that and say there's great opportunities and great challenges that come with the changing demographics as our church becomes more and more Latino.
Okay. Is it? Go ahead.
I can't stand up, but I think you can hear me.
Okay, good enough. Yeah, sure.
What about the Pentecostals in Latin America? Wasn't it Pope Paul VI who called for the evangelization of the baptized? And the Pentecostals seem to have fulfilled that role. I would agree with you that the council was not only the most significant event of the 20th century, probably since the Reformation it's the most, but there's another reality of the 20th century that ought to be taken into account, namely the growth of the Pentecostals. And they started in 1906 in Azusa Street in California, but they are now numbering, and this is according to several sources, 600 million in the world. And a lot of those are in South America. What do you say about them and their work with the poor?
Another very important point. Unfortunately, and this lecture series is focused on ecumenism, there's not always great ecumenical relations in those instances. Sometimes there's outright antagonism on the ground between Catholics and Pentecostals, accusations of sheep stealing, and so on and so forth. It's a growing religion in Latin America, as it is in the United States, Africa, and other places. One of the difficulties, we actually addressed this at lunch as well, Catholics, of course, lose members to the Pentecostals. But in Latin America, in 3 independent studies in 3 countries, actually the Pentecostals, although their numbers are growing, they don't retain their adherents any better than we do, on these, at least according to these sociological studies. They're very intense, conversion-oriented religions. And so while the first generation who has that experience, often a Catholic who goes over, at least in Latin America, then that doesn't always translate to their children, who then sometimes end up with no religion. So what it does is, not only does it kind of put Catholics and Pentecostals sort of fighting one another for the sheep, so to speak, it also creates a decision where everyone sort of senses they have a religious culture of choice, where religion is no longer, everybody here is Catholic, it's kind of part of your core identity. You can't imagine yourself not being Catholic. Where when you know members of your own family who have chosen to go to another religion or changed religions or changed again, religion itself, even for those who remain Catholic, becomes a matter of choice. And that's a very different kind of commitment. So the challenge that Latin America's had, and Paul VI spoke of this, John Paul II, and of course Pope Francis was one of the principal architects of Aparecida, that was addressed very strongly in Aparecida as well. that we need not just a cultural Catholicism, but a Catholicism of commitment, a Catholicism based on a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. And the silver lining here is this. There's a brand new book out, I mentioned this at lunch as well, by a guy named Todd Harch. It's about the revival of Christianity in Latin America. And I mean Christianity, Pentecostal, evangelical, and Catholic. Of course, the Catholic numbers in Latin America have gone up. Even though the percentage has gone down, the numbers have gone up because the population's grown so much. So Catholicism is still a very viable religion in Latin America. It's still half the Catholics in the world live in Latin America, even with this decrease. The good news is, with this religious culture of choice, and if you will, the competition with these other religions, and forgive me for speaking in such an unecumenical way, but that's exactly what's going on in many places, there's been a revitalization of Catholic commitment. So you have movements in Latin America like the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. 60% of the charismatics in the world, Catholic charismatics, are in Latin America. Lay ecclesial movements, apostolic movements, ecclesiales de base, base ecclesial communities, the various movements for justice connected with liberation theology, and others that have sprung up in Latin America over the last 50 years. If Catholics have kind of come out of their lethargy of just being a cultural religion in the countryside, to being a more committed religion, sometimes in direct response to the perceived quote-unquote threat of Pentecostals. So Catholics themselves, I mean, there's kind of a renewal going on in Latin America, and Pentecostals are part of that, but Catholics are also a huge part of it as well. Those who are staying Catholic are becoming much more deeply committed to the faith than just, my parents were Catholic, my grandparents were Catholic, I happen to be Catholic. Or they practice a certain kind of a set of devotions that make them Catholic. Now you're getting this more core sense of this is an essential part of who I am because I've had this personal experience of faith and with Christ and so on. So there's some good things that come out of this too, but what you're saying is absolutely important. That is one of, that wasn't a topic of my talk tonight, but worldwide Pentecostalism is the major religious story of the last 100 years, as you pointed out.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Okay, Elizabeth?
What hurdles, if any, is Pope Francis going to face in prioritizing preferential options for the poor?
How's he going to prioritize the What hurdles? What hurdles? Well, this, actually, I'm doing a little project with my colleagues at Notre Dame now. We're bringing in some of the, we're starting in the spring with a visit from Father Gali from Argentina, who was Pope Francis's teacher. And there's been a renewed interest in this Teología del Pueblo that's come out of Argentina, which has affected Pope Francis, and because it affected him, it's kind of gotten a little bit more traction than perhaps it did in the past. And it's sort of a branch of liberation theology, but somewhat distinct in its own way of operating. It's very pastoral and very focused on the poor as recipients and agents of evangelization. So how to kind of empower the poor. So I think Pope Francis's way of speaking about this has a wider umbrella, if you will. People who have objected to liberation theology don't object as much to this way of accompanying the poor, to seeing them as agents of evangelization. I think he very much is a pope who makes an option for the poor. So the only obstacle I really see is the lack of many of us, I'll put myself on this list, to fully live out what this means. I don't think anybody's objecting to the concept. I don't hear anybody coming out and saying, well, what he's saying about going to the margins is wrong. There are complaints about Pope Francis. I'm sure you're hearing some of them, perhaps some of you in the press. That's not one of them, at least not one of the more vocal ones. So it's not the teaching per se. It's just what's always been, I think, the challenge is how do we actually go out and live what we all, or at least most of us, want to profess to be what our Christian calling, our Catholic calling is. I think he's animating many of us. What I was asked this many times when Pope Francis was here on his visit to the United States, is this really going to change anything? Are the Catholics that have gone to the Pentecostals going to come back? And I said, well, he's a charismatic guy, but one pope in one visit isn't going to change everything. But what it is changing, and I certainly see it, he energizes the base of lay leaders, of all leaders, but I think those lay grassroots, poor people who themselves are leaders in Latin America, among U.S. Latinos, they are highly energized by Francis. And to the extent that he energizes the lay leaders who are doing the day-to-day work of the church out in the streets, out in the barrios, I think that's where he's having his deepest impact on the option for the poor as a lived reality in the day-to-day life of our church. Thank you all very much for the attention and for being here this evening.